Herzlich willkommen zum The Unleash People Podcast, dem Podcast für alle, die HR und Talent Acquisition strategisch denken. Wir, Ina und Christian, liefern euch gemeinsam mit Expertinnen und Experten regelmäßig frische Insights, die euch und euer Unternehmen voranbringen. Heute sprechen wir mit Hang Li, Curator bei Recruiting Brainfood, über Skills-Based Hiring und noch ganz viel mehr. Good morning, everyone, and for you, Hang, it's good afternoon. Well, thank you very much for joining this, let's call it podcast, videocast. And today the goal or the initial goal is to speak a bit about skills-based hiring. I remember it was last year, Hang, we sat at the what was it, in Berlin, at the summit from We Are Developers outside in the sun and spoke about that topic, at least initially. So right now it's still one of those things that recruiters think is one of the big trends in 2025. I have a slightly different opinion on that, but let's push that to the back. Hang, what's your opinion on skills-based hiring? Is there a difference from this year to, let's say, the years before? What's your take on that?
I think that we have evolved the conversation on skills-based hiring. So it's always good to see advancements on the conversation. I think we had a period where essentially it was one of those HR and TA generally has a habit of like widely adopting an idea or a concept without like undue consideration. And when skills-based hiring kind of re-emerged in 2023, 2024, that kind of period, it kind of felt that, okay, it seems that, we're just jumping in straight away without truly thinking about what we're doing. And I did detect last year there was beginnings of some, counterpoints, some good arguments against, some reasoned debate that was starting to happen. And I think that's put a conversation in a better place. I think ultimately there's lots of values in the concept of recruiting based on skills. I don't think anybody disagrees with this. We're hiring for people typically with skills to do a particular job. We have this concept in mind. But it isn't straightforward to abandon other bits of information and assume that skills-based hiring translates firstly across different types of job groups, different types of company, different types of organization, different levels of maturity, and even if it's still unproven as to whether the outcome of adopting skills-based hiring is necessarily superior to any other method of hiring. I think that was kind of an overstatement that's still to be concluded. We don't have enough information to say that is a positive or negative in terms of better company performance, for instance. I don't think that's still particularly clear. So yeah, we've got it. We're still flawed. We're still battling over it. This is all good. I don't think we should be embarrassed to say that we have contested spaces. That's a good thing. And we've evolved the conversation. So yeah, I think that's where we're at with skills-based hiring generally.
I think if I can jump in here, being not in TA, it's maybe interesting to define a little bit like what exactly companies do when they do skill-based hiring. Two reasons for that. It sounds, if you take it like super radical, it's like, okay, I only look at skills. I don't care about anything else. You can be like the brilliant jerk or whatever. And what in HR I see quite often is that I have all those buzzwords like, hey, we have to work on talent density or this or this. And at the end, it's not really what they do. They're just using the vocabulary. So like in real life and practice, how do companies do skill-based hiring at the moment?
That's a really good point. I think this is where the cynics will have a good time to play. Because let's take a cynical person, will look at it and think, okay, what skills-based hiring has kind of turned into is simply ignoring the academic degree. And to say, okay, we no longer require degrees, therefore we are skills-based hiring. I think probably a lot of companies could fall into that bucket. So it's not a huge change. You've just decided to either ignore the academic criteria, or you have simply stated you're not reviewing it or putting it as an input in your consideration, I do think that's forward progress, actually. So this is not a criticism, not a particularly a strong criticism of skill or of this direction, but it's not a substantive shift from your method of assessment. But as you say, certain companies are more radical. They would, let's say, completely abandon the concept of a CV. So let's say they're not going to even receive it. And they're only interested in people who have anonymously completed some sort of assessment, which they think is a test of the skills that they're looking for. And then from there, they will presumably be highly encouraged to move that individual forward. But even so, those companies would still go through things like an interview before making a decision. So they're not like pure skills-based hiring, because if it was completely pure, you'd simply offer them straight away. I mean, there would be no requirement for human interaction. If you're purely skills-based hiring, here, do the test complete, got the job. That should be it. But of course, that's not it. So we have to put the human interviewer in. And that's when, skills-based hiring isn't a pure concept, because there's other things involved in making a good hire. It's not just a human being is not just, just like a job is not a list of tasks. A human being is not a list of skills. We're much more complicated than that.
Yeah, and I guess it's also probably a question of definition. So what would you define as skills-based hiring? If you take the radical approach, just like you said, Hang, I'm not sure whether you would hire any person that really contributes positively to your company. Maybe you have a lucky shot every now and then, but overall you just might miss the target completely every other hiring. So what I didn't get with the complete discussion on skills-based hiring is the way people saw it as a super evolution in recruiting if they just take bits and pieces out of it. And I was always wondering, how did companies hire in the past? Like, they get a CV, they see a university they are interested in, they see a job title they are interested in, and they don't check anything in between. So that's also no way of finding appropriate talent and finding the right person for your role, right? So as soon as you do interviews, I assume you would always look into at least some skills of the person and kind of figure out whether the person can do what you are looking for. So if you take a, let's call it, more or less normal recruiting approach, you always look into skills as well. And I don't know why the TA world is always falling for extremes, right? If you do something, it needs to be completely that and nothing else. It's the same in HR or in general HR as well. So there is no middle ground and no, I hate to say it, no common sense in applying tools, in applying concepts, because sometimes it seems that HR and TA cannot develop their own concepts. They just pick this and that from somewhere else, from engineering, from project management, and they use it without reflection and saying, this is something we're doing now. And it's the A-player concept. We stole it from military without knowing what it actually means. We are doing it with skills-based hiring. We are doing it with AI, not completely, but some do. It's AI, it must be good. We use everything that has AI on it. So why are we doing that? Please help me. I don't understand.
You've painted a really tough picture of the people operations side of the business, Christian. But I think you're absolutely correct. We lack like institutional confidence. I think the function itself lacks confidence. So you compare us, for instance, with another function, finance, sales, whatnot. They all have a little bit more confidence of their contribution to the business than we do. And I think at root, that's kind of the reason why we're always trying to to kind of create credibility. If you think about what we're trying, manufacturing credibility, right? So if a person that tries to do that at a personal one-to-one level, you'd immediately think that's the most discrediting thing you can do. But you do it because you have that insecurity. And I think that's true for us institutionally. So what we do about this, I'm not sure. I think there's probably an anthropology behind how this emerged. Maybe it's got something to do with the recency of the function compared to others. Perhaps it's got to do with the size of the function in terms of payroll or the sort of early sort of origins of the function as it emerged really as an administrative function for managing payroll. So we're coming from kind of like a low status route. And perhaps this is the inevitable consequence of coming from that route. We're like the Dalits of the business world. We're always carrying that insecurity. Hopefully, we'll mature from it, but there's maybe a long journey to go.
That's actually a really good point. The maturity of the whole HR function, and it's really not long that we go down into strategy. And what I see quite often also in my HR world is that my colleagues have really, really great ideas, but they have a hard time to bring them to the business because they don't speak the language. And maybe also this is trying with like easy or very easy to remember concepts, jumping on trends to bring in new concepts. Like that, a little bit like extreme communication, because that's what I see very often. You have that with the skill-based hiring. You have the other side as well with that hire for attitude, train for skills. You can also be super extreme. So it's always that, something you can remember very easily and then trying to follow that very strictly. It's a good point with the maybe insecurity and growing into the more strategic and guiding role.
Yeah, that might be one of the root causes or reasons why we are doing that. But probably let's look back a bit to skills-based hiring. And Ina, you just mentioned one of my other very favorite topics in recruiting, hire for, what was it?
Hire for attitude,
Yes,
train
train for
for
skills.
skills.
I really would like to see that for a nuclear power plant engineer. He's a nice guy, but he can learn how to run the power plant, right? I guess it's definitely the opposite of skills-based hiring. So if we were to, let's say, find the middle common ground between those two things, how would you then approach it, Hang? How would you kind of have a very good skills assessment plus personality assessment that in the end we hire that person that can do the job, let's say also is productive rather fast and still is a team fit? So what would be the elements for that in your opinion?
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I think most mature sort of organizations like competent recruitment functions would probably include all of those pieces. We're a little bit of us kind of critiquing either one of these kind of concept at a conceptual level is because once we pull it from the context, then it becomes difficult for us to understand it. But we often do slide it into context in practicality. So I think certainly the skills sort of assessing for capability, functional capability, I think that makes sense. There's very few jobs. Actually, that's not true. There's certain jobs that do require domain knowledge, as you mentioned, a brain surgeon, classic example, stuff like this. You're going to need to have the knowledge, or at least, in a pre-AI world, you needed to have the knowledge. Debatable whether that's still the case. But let's assume that we would not hire a brain surgeon unless we saw some big track record of this person doing that work. And then the attitude, I think all of us would also agree is super important, particularly if the job is kind of got high collaboration intensity. So a lot of it is to do with the job function itself. Like, there's certain jobs, if they're quite isolated, then, maybe the attitude is not necessarily the main thing, because the individual is going to be working pretty much in an individuated way. However, if they're contributing, high collaboration, they'll impact other people, then obviously we need to escalate the attitude sort of an assessment. The team fit assessment needs to go higher to the top of the priority list. So some analysis as to, the collaboration intensity is a long term, but it's the right sort of term to use. The job itself, does it involve working with other people at high, regularly, or can the job be done pretty much by one person isolated? And lots of jobs can. Then you rebalance what you need and when. It's the same calibration we do when we think about, is a job full time or is it like a project? If it's a full-time, long-term job, we think, look, we're actually we have immediate needs today, but we also want to bring this person in for future capacity building and, contributing to team long-term company building type stuff. Of course, the attitude is much more important. If we needed to drop someone in to project manage a campaign for 6 months or 6 weeks, yeah, I could probably be a little bit looser on those criteria. So yeah.
Yeah, but in the end, what you just said also is kind of pointing into a specific direction. You need to know whom you are recruiting for. You need to know the scope of the role. You need to know the tasks. You need to know preferably also the goals the person needs to kind of achieve in the first few weeks, month, right? And based on that, you set up the specific interview process for that role. And then you do it in a very structured way, ask the same questions, do the same case studies, whatever, to figure out which person is the most suitable person for this specific role, right?
You've just introduced the third dimension, actually, that I should have mentioned. Like for instance, you may not know, like your degree of knowledge as to what you need is actually variable also. So for instance, if you've recruited this role repeatedly over time and it's pretty much a fixed role, then yeah, I think you can be highly structured in your assessment because you've got that previous experience. However, we are moving down a world where we're starting to recruit for jobs which no one has ever done before. Because the technology innovation has really outpaced it. So suddenly we're starting to get jobs that you can legitimately say there is not anybody walking around with this job title. We don't actually know, in which case we need to be much more flexible about our assessment approach. And again, here is where I wonder the attitude comes up a little bit more in terms of what we need, because actually, we with the candidate coming in will have much greater scope to form the role, rather than just sliding into a preset framework that we've already fixed. So role maturation is probably something we also need to factor in when we start shaping the assessment criteria. And as we keep talking like this, obviously it becomes, okay, we're going to have to customize every single assessment criteria for every single context. Looks like completely unscalable. Yes, that's all true. And it's just about trade-off that we need to make. So we've got to think, look, from a reporting point of view and a logistics point of view, the simplest thing is to roll out a universal recruitment approach, irrespective of all of the things we've talked about. We're just going to roll this out, and people fit in or they don't fit in. And the trade-off there is that it becomes easier to manage, but probably our quality of hire will be quite variable, because we're trying to shove everyone into the same mold. But we probably do it faster, right? So it's like high production, high quantity. There's a value there. However, if we want to go hyper customized, everything is like bespoke to every single job circumstance, probably it's going to take a huge amount of work. So it's going to be super inefficient. But yeah, do we end up hiring slightly better people, significantly better people now and again? Probably as well. So it's a trade-off.
I think what I found very interesting, especially with all those new roles where you don't have the experience, is to really measure the quality of hire to see if your approach works. Because I figured that out also in other companies, that when I asked the business about, okay, what are the targets within the first 90, 100 days of that role or that person that we're going to hire, they were like, they really had a hard time to answer. Well, they always have a hard time to answer, but I think for new roles that you never had before, that's even a little bit more tricky.
It's super hard, and in fact, KPIs itself is another concept that we've imported from another function. And there's reason to criticize KPIs, particularly if you are hiring for super innovative, super new stuff. So KPIs coming in. There's a really interesting sort of couple of interviews from an AI-based company. I don't know whether you guys have heard of DeepSeek recently, the Chinese AI company that blew up everything. The CEO had some really interesting interviews that he did about 6 months or so ago. A lot of it was about his hiring approach. And he was specifically anti-KPI. He said, look, the problem with KPIs is that they're only useful if we know what the job is. And we are hiring people to build, he's very frank, he wants to build artificial general intelligence. We're hiring some people to do something that has never been done before. That requires a huge amount of experimentation. Experimentation means inefficiency. So they're not going to do good on KPIs because there's nothing to execute. They could just be sitting in a room thinking about the problem, right? That doesn't appear on a spreadsheet as to whether they're actually performing or not. But that is essential thinking time for them to come up with these breakthroughs. And so the approach there is zero key performances. We don't even know what key performance is. We just got to constantly build an experimental culture. And if we think an experiment has got some sort of proofs, we're going to just invest in that and see where it goes. And so quality of hire is really tough to recruit for if the job is new. Totally not the case if the job is done before and it's a very standard job. You can measure the quality of hire, but I think you struggle to roll it across everything because it's even things like software engineering is a good example. Like, let's say software engineers who work together in a team. How do we know who's a capable engineer? Is it about the lines of code they produce? Is it about sometimes you're solving very simple problems. So if a developer ends up solving 100 very simple problems in the space of a week, is that a better developer than someone who takes 6 weeks to solve one really, really hard problem, but really important one? We can't measure that, right? So KPIs again it's kind of like a flawed metric, flawed measure, useful but not decisive, I think.
Yes, and basically you're opening another bucket of things, right? Really hiring people who are doing stuff that has never been done before. That's a completely different approach, right? And you're right. There is no way of measuring their performance. Basically, you can measure performance of that role after 5 years when there are sufficient enough people in the market who have done that, and you have some kind of framework you can measure against what means doing a good job in that area. The rest is plainly it's research. It's the same as we do in universities when we research stuff. It's a trial and error thing, and I know some people call research useless or wasted time in whatever area you do it, but without that we would still live in caves probably, and do stuff. But yeah.
Christine, you just a quick sidebar, but the academic world is actually in a crisis precisely because its measures of success have encouraged the wrong kinds of behavior. So, for instance, researchers basically win by publishing stuff and being proven to be correct. So what ends up happening is that it makes the incentive is for researchers to then work on problems that they know have a high likelihood of actually being successful, and therefore a high likelihood of being published. And so we end up focusing a lot of really intelligent people on trivial problems that aren't even problems sometimes. They're just things that get published. Whereas lots of problems that are really hard, really important, there's no incentive to actually get people to do that because we've set the KPI in the wrong place. So key performance is useful but dangerous. You've got to almost constantly calibrate what you want, what the outcome is, because it's a little bit of a distance between that and the behavior that the person is performing. Not easy, man.
No, not at all. So we are turning circles, I guess, and there is no solution at all, unless we just keep trying. But there's one point, and that we need to know what role we are recruiting for. And if it's a role that has never been kind of recruited for before, we need to use other ways of assessing and evaluating people, and also, let's say, setting goals and targets in comparison to the normal engineering role, like staff engineer. We know that person is not there to solve tricky question. That person is there to code, to bring the architecture to life, to write code that works and is as easy as possible. Whereas when we are recruiting for an architect, that person needs to develop the structure, develop the complete architecture of the tool, of the software, right? And that's what we know. So we have some kind of boundaries left and right in which we can move and try to be as accurate in our assessments as possible. There is never a 100% probability of doing things correctly. And honestly, recruiters who say they have never mishired someone are either incredibly lucky or they lie. Because, well, working in recruiting for me, it's 16 years now. If I would say I never hired a wrong person, I would definitely lie, because I did. And I also did bad interviews, and it's always a way of calibrating and trying to find the best way possible.
Yeah, and I think
So
for new roles, when you really don't know where can I get those people or whatsoever, it's still important to take the time to think about what those people have to bring in, right, to solve the problem. Because the problem is something you might have even if you don't know the role and it's new.
Yeah, absolutely. You can actually be really creative. A creative recruiting approach for a new role is probably correct. So, haven't got a highly structured thing, but perhaps an invitation for people to help solve a problem. Perhaps you start a debate, maybe even start a webinar to say, hey, we've got this problem, let's talk about it. And then the people who come on to talk about it with some credibility, maybe the starting points of, building some sort of idea of what the job is. And perhaps even some of those people might even be a potential candidate for it. So yeah, there's ways in which we can kind of go to market with an unfinished, and I know this is like considered to be bad practice, but it's also sometimes a problematic if we go to the market with a like completely finished idea as to how our recruitment is going to work, because what we know, at least from startup, is that actually the strategization prior to contact with the market usually is incorrect. Like the first thing you got to do is contact the market and have a really constant feedback loop with it so that you can understand how to shape the job, and the strategy to recruit that job. So maybe this is the sort of a new job is probably a perfect time to do that type of experiment.
yeah, that's correct. So what would be if we again loop back to let's say our initial discussion, what would be your final advice to the audience? How to approach a reasonably good way of finding and hiring the right people?
I think it does start from internally. So, understand what it is, like be very honest with your own sort of requirements. Oftentimes we don't do that because we feel pressured to have an elevated sense as to why we're recruiting these people, or some sort of we feel that the external messaging has dragged us to say certain things about a job which isn't true. You've got to just be very honest with what it is you're looking for and why. And the strategy should emerge from this. It's when we kind of do it the other way around, where we have the strategy prior to being honest with ourselves about how we recruit, or we end up in trouble. So I think essentially what I'm saying is that recruitment should be an inside out type of approach, even though oftentimes it feels like an external only activity. So the nature of recruiting is that the boss has told us to go and recruit. We on the same day will charge out to try and recruit people. And actually, you probably want to just understand internally what it is that you're looking for first before you do that. And the ideas will be better. The people will be more accurate when you're having those conversations, and hopefully more efficient as you do it.
Yeah, correct. Ina, you as a non-recruiting person, what would be your final take on that?
I think I really liked the part when we discussed a bit about creativity instead of just thinking in our old ways or blindly following new trends and concepts. So I think that's a really good point that I take with me. And the other one is what we have in common, TA, HR, well, it's one world, is that, they're trending. So talking about extremes and really setting a focus, while in reality, I think most companies do kind of a mix. I think I never saw a company who really radically purely hired for skills or for attitude. You always need that mix and just a practical approach, I'd say, right?
Yeah, that's it. There's, I guess, nothing I could add because everything has been said. So, folks, thank you very much for joining. It was a pleasure speaking with you. And I wish you a very good start of the day for Ina and me, and rest of the day for you, Hang. Thank you very much. Bye. Das war's für heute. Vielen Dank, dass ihr bis zum Ende dabei geblieben seid und bis zum nächsten Mal.